Okay, so we're going to get started. As promised, we're not having a midterm today, right? Good for you. Welcome back from spring break. I'm still somewhat on spring break because clearly I screwed up on questions and whatever else, so life is what it is. Today we're going to cover Chapter 3, Wood. I did decide over the break that Chapter 3 is not going to be on the midterm, right? So we're going to do it today, but we're going to hold off on having it on the test until the final, so that'll keep all the wood together, right? So you're not studying different things. So I do have a practice midterm that you'll do at the end of class today. So we'll have a classic lecture, break, lecture, and then there'll be the practice midterm. I will pass it out. I'd encourage you to stay around and do it, and then you can ask me questions if you don't understand something. But if you want to go, you can go. That's your choice. You're all big people. This is a college class. You can do what you want, right? So today, some of you I know print the slides ahead of time. You probably noticed there was an awful lot of text and not very many images in the slides. That is because the stuff that goes with the slides is all up here, right? Because for whatever reason, probably because it's easier to access, we have plenty of samples of wood and not so many samples of everything else. So a lot of what we'll do today will have to do with actually looking at the physical pieces of wood and talking about them, etc. So I will continue to be passing things around all day. If you guys at the back end up with extra stuff, you can just leave it on the center of the table and I'll clean it up later. It's not a particularly big deal. So in order to really get into wood, we have to start with where wood comes from, which is trees. And so this is by no means a botany class. We're not going to get into the intricacies of how trees work and how they grow and that sort of thing. But there are certain characteristics of a tree that are important for you to be aware of, right? And we'll try to talk about what they mean relevant to building construction, not just out of the blue. These are the parts of a tree. So we have an outer protection of dead bark, which is what we're traditionally, if we were tree huggers and we went out into the forest and put our arms around a tree, that would be what we'd touch, right? That's the outer layer of dead bark. We have an inner layer of living bark, which is right inside here, right? It's composed of hollow longitudinal cells that conduct the nutrients up from the roots up into the leaves of the tree, or the needles of the tree if it's a conifer, right? Right next to that, we have what's called the cambium layer, right? Which is what's responsible for creating and building new cells, right? Anybody ever heard of girdling a tree before? Right? This is the way if you really want to get rid of a tree and you don't want people to know that you want to get rid of a tree, this is how you get rid of a tree, right? But what you can do, and this actually happens because if you wanted to, let's say you decided you were going to hang a hammock, right? And you were really obsessed about the structure of your hammock and you wanted to make sure that it was secure when it was against the tree, and you went around the tree with a cable, right? And you fastened it and you attached your hammock to the tree, okay? Then you forgot about it, and you got old, right, and the tree kept growing, okay? As the tree grows, right, that girdle, or that ribbon, right, will stay in its place, and at some point, the tree, right, will grow past what this cambium layer and the inner bark layer is, right, and it'll kill the tree, because the tree, as it grows out, can't continue to conduct the nutrients, because that's up and down the outside of the tree. So, anyway, if you wanted to get rid of a tree, not that you would, right, if you just cut around the base of the tree, you don't cut the whole tree, but you just cut around the bark and you disrupt that layer, you'll effectively do the same thing and kill the tree. So don't go out and do that, but that illustrates the point, right? So inside of that, if we get rid of the bark, right, we have a thick layer of living wood cells, right, inside the cambium. That's called the sapwood, right, which is this outer stuff. It's a little bit lighter color. Right? This is where all the nutrients are stored. This is kind of the active part of the tree. Okay? Inside of that, right, is what's called the heartwood. This is when the sapwood dies, right? But it stays part of the tree. So you guys have seen the old like photographs of like the giant redwoods with the car going through the tree, right? In the middle of the tree is gone. Well, it's all the dead wood of the tree. So it's not killing the tree. The ring around the outside is what's keeping the tree alive, right? That's why the tree is still standing. So we've got heartwood and we've got sapwood and we've got heartwood, right? It's usually a darker in color. It's harder to distinguish, right? And this is our first example here, right? It's harder to distinguish on some trees, but you can see a distinct color difference, right? This is a little bit lighter, so that would be the sapwood. This is a little bit darker, so this would be the heartwood, okay? And so the tree that's on the photograph is obviously much easier to see. Right? So in the very, very center of the tree is something called the pith. Right? And we'll see if we can. This one's harder to see on that side. I know this is one of those things. It's like, do I turn all the lights on and then you can't see the slides, or what? But if you look really carefully, and I'll eventually pass this around, the pith is that centermost ring. Right? It's the start of the whole tree. And that little center ring marks what is the first year's growth of the tree. Right? So when it was a tiny little baby, that's what it was. And so that's called a pith. It's also the weakest part, right, of the tree. Sorry, I'm trying to keep this whole thing together because I need it later. Okay, so in terms of tree anatomy, right, and this is like, I'm not going to ask you to be able to draw something like this. I want you to kind of understand why there are different types of wood and what they represent, right? But we have to talk a little bit about it to get there. So basically, a tree is made of tubular cells whose long axis runs parallel with the trunk of the tree, right? So the cells are running up the height of the tree, right? The cells are structured of a really tough cellulose, right? And the cells are bound together with this thing called lignin, right? Which is always difficult to say, okay? The direction of the long axis of the cells, right, is referred to as the grain of the wood, right? And if you look carefully at the samples that I pass around, you'll be able to see that, okay? So the cambium layer, which I talked about, which is right inside that inner living bark, right, manufactures the sapwood cells in early spring, okay? No surprise that there's going to be a bunch of growth happening in the early part of the year, right? So like right now, okay? What's ample right now? Pollen, yes. Water, right? We've got the big snow melt. There's a lot of water. Life is great. Trees say, great, I can grow because I've got the food and the water that I need to grow, okay? So it occurs really rapidly at that point of time, right? These are called springwood or early wood cells, right? So it's rapid growth, a lot of cells, okay? The growth is slower in the summer because it gets drier and hotter, and so the tree can't, right, less water, it can't grow as fast, right? The cells are more dense than the springwood, and we get what's called summerwood or late wood cells, right? These are the stages that result in the rings of a tree, right? So if we look at this sample again, right, and I will pass this around eventually. Actually, you know what? You guys can have a bit of it, right? So if we look at this tree, see which side is better to look at. We'll look at this side, right? And I'm talking to you guys, but I'll spin around and talk to you guys eventually too, right? So if we look at this, right, we see the rings. The lighter stuff is that early wood cell, right? And the darker stuff is the late wood, right? So it's much denser, less water, harder to grow. That's why we get the rings of the tree in the different colors, right? So we've got our early wood or our spring wood, followed by our summer wood, right, which gives us the rings of the tree, right? Which is exactly why, if you were ever a kid and you went out to the forest, right, and you wanted to see how old the tree was, you sat there and counted how many rings there were, right? No surprise, because these represent each year that the tree has grown. So we move forward, and we have two different types of wood. We have what's called softwood, which comes from coniferous trees, which are trees with needles and cones, right? And we have hardwood, which is wood that comes from broadleafed trees, okay? The names are completely deceptive because softwood can be more dense than hardwood and vice versa, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with the density of the wood. So, for example, right, I'm going to pass around two things, okay? This one, right, which is a little bit lighter in color, is a hardwood, right? This one, which is a little bit darker and a little dirty, is a softwood, okay? But I want you to feel the difference in the weight, right? And you'll probably recognize what the hardwood is, right? And this is to illustrate the point that just because it's softwood or just because it's hardwood doesn't indicate what that material is like. So make sure when you guys get around, I know you'll get at the end, right? I'll start that way with something else, right, that you see this. So softwood trees, right, have a simple microstructure consisting mainly of the longitudinal cells with only a small percentage, right, of radial cells, right, that interrupt it. So these are the longitudinal cells that I'm talking about, right, all these tall ones, right? Every once in a while there's a little bit of a radial cell that's going outward, okay, but it's rare. hardwood trees have a very different grain structure, right? They have a lot of different cells. They have the longitudinal cells, right? But and those are fibers, which are small diameter, and vessels, which are large diameter. So we see the vessels, and then we see the fibers, or the thinner ones, right? And then we have rays, right, which are in here. We've got a bunch of different pieces, right, that are going in different directions, which results in that. So the best way to illustrate this is to start to talk about hardwoods and show you some of the differences, right? So we're going to pass a few of these around, right? You guys can have those two. You guys can have these. These two are hardwood. They're oak, right? And I will also pass this around, which is a whole bunch of different hardwoods, right? So you can see the different colors that come in it. And I'll walk around with something like this. But if you look really closely at the samples that I'm passing around to you right now, you can see that it's very, very, there's a lot of different swirls, different grains, different little cells. If you look carefully at it, things that are coming out at you, right, as part of this grain, and you guys will see it when it comes that way, right? But you can see it looks very different. Then, right, a softwood, which I will start passing around in contrast, which doesn't have those little interesting things happening. It's very uniform in its look, right? We don't have all of those little cells that are pointing out at us, right? It's just kind of a consistent, relatively boring piece of wood. Right? So I'll pass these guys around too, so you can see those. Right? Look at the end grain down here, right, when you get these hardwood samples, and you can see some of the differences in what's happening. So look at the end grain down here, right? You can see there's more pieces kind of coming towards you, right? You can see the little cells versus the softwood, which is coming, and it'll look very different. They don't necessarily end up in a branch. They're actually in the structure of the tree as well. Generally, a knot is going to be what the sign of a branch is. Right, so it's a very distinctly different. I don't know. Right, so here's an example of where a branch would have been. Right, so we have the knot, and you can see it's a very different, completely different structure to it. It does change the further in it gets smaller. Right, but the further out toward the edges of the tree, the more you're going to get something like that.
So this would be like radio.
Exactly. So you've got grain here. Sorry, let me set this down. You've got grain, but if you look at it, see how those are kind of these longitudinal little swoops that are scalloped out, right? Those are those different types of cells. They're part of this grain that I'm talking about. We still see, right, the early wood and the late wood, but you can tell that the cells themselves are different. Right? So as is today, and this is the way today's going to go a little bit, there's going to be a lot of I'm going to stop and talk to you, and so bear with me when I talk through some different things. But there's no way to do it other than to point to specific things. Right? Yes? This one? Yes. You know, this is balsa wood. Right? Which is for usually like model airplanes, that kind of stuff. It's an incredibly lightweight wood. It will float very, very easily. But it is a hardwood. And if you look very carefully at it, especially once you've seen the oak and that sort of thing, it has the same grain structure and the same kinds of weird radial cells. It just happens to have much less density to it.
What tree does it come from?
Balsa. It's a balsa tree. Yeah.
I mean, what does it look like? What does the tree look
A broadleaf like a maple or something like that. So this is a softwood, right? And so it has a relatively uninteresting grain structure, just like this one does, right? If we look at something like this, that's the oak. If you look carefully at it, see how it has these little like scoop outs that are happening, right? Those are the cells that are radial cells that are working in a different direction, right? And you have to kind of look carefully at it. It looks like there's these little chunks that are out of it. Those are those types. But we still have the summer wood, right? These two are softwood. This is hardwood.
What are these?
You can see it on the end here really well. See those different pieces that are running this way, right? They should be all running this way, right, in a softwood. And so if you look at this, see how you don't see any of those?
Yeah.
It's a good contrast, right? See all those running the different direction? You don't see that at all here. So this is softwood. This is hardwood.
That's how you tell the difference usually?
Yeah, it would be the grain structure. There's some, generally you learn to see what a hardwood looks like when you get this one. Sorry, I'm stealing this. You can have it again, right? You can kind of see really easily, what the hardwood ones look like just by their. See, it has the same kinds of little pieces on it. That has the same little pieces on it, right? So as you go through, I think in this block there are some that aren't. Maybe they're all. Of course, it's the wrong direction. Yeah, these are all hardwood. So this will eventually make it around to you. Okay, you can have it back. Sorry. You might have to. Were you looking for just like that? Okay. So making sense to you guys? Yeah. Let me borrow one of those. Does anybody have a quarter sawn oak? Thank you. I'll come to you guys next. All right. Can't do it. You guys are too in the dark, right? So if you look really carefully, this might be easier, right? So if we look carefully at the end grain, this might be the easiest place to see it, right? See how in the end grain there's all those lines that are running this way, right? Where in the softwood, we don't see any of those little lines. Does that make sense? Those lines are the radial cells, in addition to the longitudinal cells. Where in here, we don't have the radial cells, so we're not seeing those in any direction. We're just seeing the characteristics, early wood and late wood rings. That's it. Does that kind of make sense? Does that help see it a little bit better? So likewise, right? We have the softwood and the hardwood. If you look at the end grain here, you can see a lot of the radial cells, right? Where if we're looking in the softwood, you don't see those radial cells, right? And so that's part of kind of how you're telling the difference. You can learn to see it anyway as you look at it. Does that make sense? See those? We're getting to all of you, right? So if we look at these here, right, this is the softwood, this is the hardwood, right? If we look at the end grain, we're not seeing any of the radial cells. See all those little lines that are going this way? Those are radial, and they're not present in the softwood, right? We don't see any of those lines. We see the rings, right? So we have the early wood and the late wood that's happening, right? But we don't have all those striations that are working in this direction. Does that make sense? You don't have it in the softwood because those are the radial cells, the ones that are going outward, instead of the longitudinal, which is the long one. That's the same thing. That's a hardwood. Well, this is the same end grain, so you're seeing the same thing. It's just two different types of wood, right? So this is an oak and this is a pine, right? Conifer has needles and cones for the pine. This is an oak broadleaf. We're almost through it, right? Everybody's almost had this, right? But this is probably the best illustration, right? So I have pine, which is a coniferous softwood, and I have a hardwood, which is an oak, right? But if we look at this end grain, do you see all those striations that are in the end grain that are going this direction, right? Those are the radial cells that are happening, right? Those are distinctly not in the softwood, right? They're all the longitudinal cells. So in here we have the longitudinal cells, but we also have those radial cells.
You're talking about swirls and stuff too? Are there swirls?
See these little lines? Yes, there are some swirls, but do you see those little lines that are running?
Yeah.
Right? Those are the distinct difference
Is
between
it just
the softwood and the
ends that you
hardwood.
match up and the sides could be...
You can see it on the sides too. If you look carefully, you can see some, kind of the scoops in the sides. Those are those little radial lines.
Oh, okay.
But it's harder to see, right? That's softwood. It's cut on an angle, so it's a little...
But not swirls. You're not talking about swirls.
No, that's the grain. We'll talk about that in a second. Right? That's different. It's just these little kind of small scale stuff. Okay, so thank you guys for being patient. This is kind of how today's going to go because there's no way to show you this stuff unless we're actually talking through it. So bear with me, okay? So softwoods, right, generally considered to have a very uninteresting grain structure, right? It's kind of consistent and, quote, boring, right? That doesn't mean it's not beautiful. There's a piece that I was passing around, this piece here, that's a fir. That's a vertical grain, kind of tightly spaced fir. This is a prized wood, right, if you're building a cabin or something like this. It's very expensive to buy, just like it would be a hardwood. So just because it's uninteresting doesn't mean some people don't like it, right? But anyway, softwood lumber, uninteresting grain structure. It's most often the lumber that's used for building framing, right? Anything that you're not going to see, it's going to be used with softwood, and that's because it's less expensive and more plentiful, right? So if you think about the forests that are up near Tahoe, the forests that are in kind of the Pacific Northwest, there's an awful lot of these kinds of trees, right? The firs, the pines, those kinds of things. They're relatively inexpensive to get here, right? Also, right, they grow really fast, right, which is a big advantage. Okay, hardwoods on the other, yeah, yes, yes. It's always good to. I'm glad you brought it up, right? If we were in, say, Brazil, right, where there's a bunch of hardwood, right, hardwood's going to end up being a little bit cheaper than it would be here because we import most of our hardwood, right? And then back east, there's maples and some broadleaf trees, more of that kind of stuff. So it's a little cheaper back there than it would be out here. But for the most part, you're gonna do things based on what woods you have available. Even if you're in an area, let's say Brazil, where there's a lot of broadleaf hardwood trees, there are still probably some varieties of softwood trees that grow faster, in which case those are probably cheaper as well, right? So the other big advantage, even though they're more plentiful here, is that they grow a lot faster, right? Which is kind of a big thing, certainly for the sustainability conversation. So hardwood is considered to have a very beautiful grain structure. It has a lot of swirls in it, right? Has kind of a tight grain. It's also really, really durable wood, or it can be really durable. I mean, obviously the balsa that I passed around is the bad example of that because it's not very durable. But typically we would think of things like floors, right? Something that's very decorative and hence hardwood floor, right? As opposed to softwood floor. That doesn't mean that all hardwood floors are in fact hardwood. They might be softwood, but you get the idea. Okay? It's used for fine furniture, interior finish details, those kinds of things. It's more expensive because it's less plentiful, right? Broadleaf trees take a lot longer to grow, therefore they're more expensive when you cut them down. Okay? That brings up a good kind of topic, which is something that's called certified wood. And you may have encountered this at some point. You may not have really known what it meant. My wife actually encountered this when she was looking at play structures for our daughter. And she was, this wood says it's certified wood. That must mean it's great, And I'm like, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's great from a health standpoint. She was thinking it was healthier than some other wood because that's, of course, what she's interested in. Instead of the health of the wood, it has to do with the health of the forest as a whole. Right? So this is a certification board, right? The Forest Stewardship Council that certifies wood that says this particular forest is being managed in a sustainable manner, right? And by sustainable manner, it means that you're not going in and clear cutting the forest and taking all the trees, right? You're instead going through and selectively taking out older trees, dead trees, trees that are reasonable to get rid of. You're planting new trees so that the new trees grow up, and you're actively managing the forest so it maintains good habitat and that sort of thing, right? And we've actually come into, this is going off on a complete tangent, but why not, right? We've run into a big problem in the world of forest management that started in kind of the 1950s with Smokey the Bear, right? And so the Forest Service, the U.S. Department of Forestry and the Forest Service, decided that this campaign against forest fires was a really good thing, right? And so they fought hard to get everybody to be aware of forest fires and not have them happen, which is, of course, a good thing for property owners that are in the vicinity of where there was a forest fire, right? The problem is it's changed the demographic of the forest, right? The types of trees that have grown in, they're much thicker, they're much denser, there's a lot of undergrowth that connects the trees that's very different than what it used to be. And so the good example of this, if you see some of the old photographs of Lake Tahoe and that sort of thing, it's not nearly as forested as it is now, right? And the big problem with that is if a forest fire gets started, right, it's going to get up into the crowns of the trees and kill all the trees, right, which is very bad for the forest. So in the old days, we'd have small fires on the ground floor. I took a class in forest management and fire safety and whatever. It was actually a very interesting class at Berkeley. Anyway, the problem is, right, we would have these fires that would build up into the crowns of the trees, kill the whole set of trees. In the old days, right, the fires would stay on the ground and the big trees would survive, right? And it would kill off a lot of the new sprouting trees and that sort of thing. So you'd have a nice mixture of old and new trees without the ladder fuels that would jump the fire up into the crown. So that's kind of the big problem with it, which is why this kind of thing is good, right? Because we're actively managing the forest, not only for future sustainability needs and forest fires and that sort of thing. Okay, so that was a tangent, sorry, but it was interesting, I hope, right? So, lumber, okay? We have to somehow get from the tree state, right, into some kind of a piece of wood that we could use in a building, right? So, if you think about it, it's kind of intuitive what must happen, right? So somebody has to go out and cut the tree down. That's the first step, right? Which is very logical. The part you might not have thought of is forests are really big, right? And they're generally not next to a road. So it's a little bit difficult to walk out into the forest, cut a tree down, and carry this really, really heavy tree to some place where there's a road to put it on a truck to go to a lumber mill, right? So we have to think carefully, especially when we're managing forests, about how do we access these trees. How do we not destroy the land in getting to the tree, right? They've even gone to the point where sometimes they'll take trees out by helicopter, right? So they don't have to destroy the forest floor. If you see something like this, right, this is kind of the typical logging operation. We're coming in with heavy equipment, right? We're driving through, we're creating basically a road, a temporary road, through the forest to be able to get access to these trees. We drive our tractors through the forest, right? We kill off the undergrowth. It can be relatively bad. The other thing is, we don't really want all the branches and the needles and the leaves and everything that goes with the log. We want the log itself, right? And if we're looking here, notice that almost everything, including most of the bark, has been stripped off, right? So we have all this slash that we have to get rid of, which is kind of a big problem. So we could chip it up and put it down on the floor, which is one way of getting rid of it. Can be okay, right? We could chip it up, put it down on the floor, and then have a small controlled burn and burn that stuff off. That would work. We could cut it up and put it in a big pile and light the pile on fire, right? Hopefully when it was snowing or something where it wouldn't spread. But we need some way of getting rid of it. So trees do have byproducts that we have to get rid of. Now, we have also found ways of kind of reusing those kinds of things. And so there's ways that we'll talk about later on in trying to maximize the yield from each tree. Anyway, so the log is going to be stripped of its bark, right? And then it's going to be passed through a head saw, right, which could be a circular saw or a band saw, that's going to reduce the log into kind of untrimmed slabs of lumber, right? So we're working our way down. A person called the sawyer, right? Nowadays, the sawyer is becoming more computerized than it is an actual person. But it's going to judge how to obtain the maximum marketable yield from each log, right? So they're going to look at the log and they're going to say, how should we cut this log up to get the most out of it? And I'll show you some examples of what they do and how they cut these up in a second. And then they're going to use a bunch of hydraulic machinery to rotate the logs, advance the log through these kinds of saws to cut it up into the desired pieces. Okay? Finally, a conveyor belt is going to carry the rough pieces off to be surfaced and cut into smaller pieces, and they work their way down. This sounds relatively familiar to manufacturing steel, right? Right? We work our way from the large size down to the smaller size. Same thing happens with a log. So something like this, good example, we have our more rough logs, right? Recognizing this equipment is very big, right? And you want as much of automatic rollers and hydraulics as possible to lift these things. You don't want to be lifting them yourself. So anyway, these are the pieces in queue. They're going to fall down to this bandsaw. The bandsaw is going to trim these into your final kind of size dimensions, right? There's going to be some surfacing and stuff that happens with them too, but you get the idea. So in terms of how we cut up the lumber, we have a couple different ways of doing it. Plane sawing is the most common, right? It's the sequence in which the log, basically it affects the orientation of the grain, right? And we'll talk about this in just a second. So if we're looking at this, this would be the tree, right? And you see all of the rings that are happening, right? And you see each one of these boards that we cut has a slightly different grain. There's different pieces to it, and that has an effect on how the board ultimately can be used, okay? The plane saw lumber is basically a method that's the maximum yield that we can get. So if we look at this particular log, the wasted pieces, right, are just very tiny at the borders, right? And obviously the sawdust from what we cut. But there's no wasted pieces inside. We're using it at a maximum yield, okay? It's typical for structural lumber because we want the cheapest price, right? So we're going to try to use it that way. And it's going to make the most number of useful pieces. So when this happens, we get what's called flat grain. And I'll show you a couple examples of that, hopefully. Right? For whatever reason, they have really bad examples of flat grain in here. This is just harder to see. This will work. Right? So flat grain, right, looks something like this. It's when the rings of the tree, right, see how we can see the rings right there, are basically very flat to the surface of the board. Right? And so if we're cutting this particular piece, right? Here's my piece, right? I'm taking it out of here, right? And that's why we're seeing the rings of the tree, right? And so this has some side effects, and we'll talk about in a second on the next slide, I hope. Okay? So the orientation of the growth rings varies along the board's width, right? So if I pick this board up again, it's going to vary, right? We see very flat grain here, right? We're seeing more vertical grain on the sides, right? So it's going to vary across the board, depending on the size of the tree that it was cut out of, right? And the large portion of the board's wider face, which is this piece that I'm talking about right now, let's see if I can put it, right? This piece here, right? Has a grain pattern in which, right, the annual rings are oriented close to parallel with the surface, right? So if we look at and this is one of those, it's hard to put into words what flat grain is, right? And a lot of times, like on a test or something, I have people just draw it and say, this is what I mean. I don't understand what in words you're trying to say, but this is what I mean, right? That's great for test corrections. Hint, hint, right? Right? So what I'm saying is, right, the growth rings, right, that are going this way are parallel to the larger face. Right, which is why we're seeing these kinds of patterns, right? So the growth rings are parallel to the large face, right? It looks like this in the slide, okay? And so this is called flat grain lumber, okay? Flat grain lumber has a tendency to warp and distort as it seasons, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more in just a second. So another option that we have is something that's called quarter sawing, okay? It's a method that produces very stable pieces, right? But it, as a result, has a lot more waste, right? Yes, this happens in structural lumber, but it's also used for more higher, if hardwoods and that kind of thing are more often going to be cut this way, right? So the idea here is we take the log and we cut it into 4 pieces, right? And then we cut all of the boards at 90 degrees. So if we see all these rings coming through, right, notice that the annual growth rings are perpendicular to the largest face of the wood, right? So it's the opposite of flat grain, right? The problem is, look at all this waste that happens, right? We get waste in the middle, we get waste along the outside, so it's less economical, right? But we get higher quality lumber out of it, right? So it's always a trade-off. It's always an expense trade-off, right? So if we're looking at vertical grain lumber, this is a pretty good example of it. I'll take this out here for a second, right? This was cut out of the lumber like this, okay? So if we look at the end grain here, right, and we look at the side, we have all those vertical lines on each side as we go around. And if we look here, right, they're running almost perpendicular, right, to each face. No matter what face we look at, they're all running perpendicular. Does that make sense? Right? So that's how we get this vertical grain. That's a result of the quarter sawing. Did you guys see that? Sorry, I forget sometimes which table I've talked to, right? So see how these are roughly 45? Each one of these has them all perpendicular. Right? Perpendicular here, perpendicular here. Vertical grain boards tend to remain flat, right, despite their changes in moisture content. So they're very consistent. They don't warp in strange ways. Quarter sawing is more expensive because more of the log is wasted. Shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Okay? What happens when we have a giant log, right, which are few and far between? We have to make the maximum yield out of it. Sometimes we need really big pieces of lumber, right? So if we have a large log, and remember, it's not just about the diameter in one place, right? If the board's 20 feet long, you've got to have this diameter that works at the bottom, but also at the top, right? So it's not just about the diameter at the base. So if it's a really large log, right, we're going to try to take out and make some beams out of it. So this is an example of a beam, right, that would be coming out of right here. Right? And so if we look at the grain structure on something like this, right, we can see the tree. We can see where the pith would be right here, right? And we see all of the rings that are coming out this way, right? But obviously, this had to be long enough. I mean, obviously, it's cut off right now, but this had to be, say, 20 feet long. So the log that cut this out was pretty good size, right? As part of this process, right, we need to find a way to remove the water out of the wood. Okay? So, hold on. Okay. The trees are growing when we cut them down, most likely. Sometimes there's a forest fire, sometimes they're dead. The problem is, if there's a forest fire or it's dead, lumber companies don't like them as much because they either have char on them that you got to get rid of, so the yield isn't as good, and you got all this stuff that clogs up their machines, right? Or if they're already dead, they died for a reason, so they probably have some rot or some bugs or something inside, so they don't like them as much. So they would actually prefer growing live trees because they know they're healthy and they're going to get better yield out of them. That doesn't mean they won't take dead trees or fire trees because they're worth something too. They just might pay less for them, right? So growing wood contains water. No surprise. Okay? This can range somewhere between 30% and 300% of the oven-dry weight of the wood. So it can be a lot of water that's in the wood, right? After the tree is cut, as soon as the tree, quote, dies, right, some of the water is going to start to evaporate. Okay? This free water, right, which is the first to evaporate, is the water in the voids of the cells. Right? Not the water that's contained within the cells, it's the water around the cells. And so I don't know if anybody's ever had the experience of cutting down a tree before, right? But if you cut down a tree and you let it sit there, you can even put like a bowl underneath it, and the water will actually drip out of the base of the tree, right? There's that much water in it, okay? So we need a way to get that water out. When all the free water, so the water that's outside of the cells, this would be the stuff that's dripping out, right, when you cut down the tree. When all of that is out, the tree still contains somewhere between 26 and 32% moisture, right? And that water is contained within the cells themselves, right? So it's not the outside water, it's now the inside water. That's called bound water. So we have free water that's outside the cells, we have bound water that's inside the cells, and we need to get that bound water to evaporate as well, right? And so this process takes a little bit longer, but when the bound water evaporates, right, which is no surprise, you can think of a cell as being swollen with water, right? As that water starts to evaporate, the cell shrinks down, and therefore the wood shrinks, right, which is part of the problem with wood, right? So the shrinkage, the stiffness, and the strength of the wood is going to increase steadily as the moisture decreases, right? So it's kind of like concrete. The less water, the stronger it is. Same thing happens with wood, right? So wood can be dried to any desired moisture content. Okay, framing lumber is considered to be dry at 19% moisture, right? Which is actually, it's called green lumber because it's still really pretty wet, right? And so if you go to Home Depot, there'll be two stacks. There'll be a stack that's green lumber, right? And you should all do this the next time you're in Home Depot. That will be wet, right? And it will feel wet when you touch it, right? And then there'll be a stack that'll be kiln dried, right? And it'll feel dry when you touch it because it's been dried less, right? So we start at 19%. They have finer control, right? A little bit less moisture. We're at about 15%, right? A little more stable because it's already dried, right? The problem here is that wood maintains an equilibrium of moisture with whatever the humidity is wherever it is, right? So if you're back east somewhere, right, where it's really hot, humid summer, guess what? Your wood's going to retain water. And even if you put it in a kiln and dry it out, as soon as you take it outside, it's going to absorb that water back, right? So that's part of why wood expands and contracts and moves, right? Because it's absorbing and getting rid of water, right? So in California, we have relatively low humidity most of the year. So therefore, we can keep our lumber very, very dry, right? But it's going to vary. If you have a humid day, it's going to absorb some more moisture, right? So it doesn't really make much sense to drop below about 13%, right? Unless you're going to be inside, right? And the reason that this kind of matters is that if you're inside, chances are, even in California, right, you have climate control systems. You have heat, right? You have air conditioning. You have dehumidifiers, right? Even humidifiers if it's too dry, right? That kind of climate control allows you to keep moisture that's anywhere in the range of 5 to 11%, right? Because it's not going to absorb more moisture because it's climate controlled indoors, right? And so if you think of the things that are in your house, it's somewhere in the 5 to 11% moisture range, okay? Most of the lumber is going to be seasoned at the sawmill, so it's not something that's going to be dried on the building site. It can be air dried, so we can just stick it outside for a while and let it dry, right? Or we can put it inside a kiln, right, which will control the drying, right, and shorten the amount of time it takes to dry, right? So we're basically heating the wood up, or baking the wood, so to speak, to get that moisture out, right? And that's why we have kiln dried, or KD, right? So if you go to Home Depot, you'll see the kiln dried, and you'll see the green lumber, right? And it's very obvious if you touch both which one's which, right? So when we're talking about wood shrinkage, right, wood doesn't shrink and swell uniformly, right, in all directions, okay? The longitudinal shrinkage, right, which is the shrinkage if I were to hold this end and hold this end and push, that's longitudinal shrinkage. It's almost negligible, right? So the wood is always going to stay the same length, no matter how much moisture it has in it, right, roughly, okay? It will, however, shrink radially, right, and this is pretty large. So radial shrinkage, and I'm going to use my, where's my other half of? We're going to try to put this back together if I can, okay? So radial shrinkage is like, hold on, we have to rotate just a little bit. I can do this, right? So radial shrinkage, right, is shrinkage from one side to the other, right? So it's across this way. The whole thing shrinks. It's across this way. The whole thing shrinks, okay? And it shrinks a fair amount, right? So basically its diameter or its radius is getting smaller. Does that make sense? Radial shrinkage, okay? So the next one is tangential shrinkage, right, which is the worst of all of them, right? It's about twice the amount of radial shrinkage. And what results here, I'm going to set one of these down so that I can, hold on. This is like the most important one to show you guys, right? So it makes sense. Okay, so I have my log like this, right? It's shrunk radially this way, right? But this tangential shrinkage will cause the log basically to split apart. So it's shrinkage around the log, right? And so we get these checks. So this piece of log has dried out. You see this check, and this check. Those are a result, right, of the cells shrinking tangentially around the circle. Does that make sense? Right? And that's why we get these splits, or what are called checks. Stay. Okay. So if the whole log is seasoned, right, we're going to get these checks, right, which we see there as well. If you've ever been in a home that's like a log cabin, right, or been to a place where they've used logs inside the house as part of the beams and whatever, and you look at the logs, there will always be these splits on them, right? There have to be, because that's the way it shrinks. Okay? So if we look at a photo or an image like this, depending on where we cut our board, we're going to have different types of shrinkage, right? And so if we look at this upper piece, right, this is kind of the easy one to start with, right? We're going to have radial shrinkage, right? From here to here, it's going to get smaller, right? But it's not going to do too much else, okay? Because it's cut, we've got nice vertical grain. That's part of why vertical grain is valuable, right? It's not going to shrink, it's not going to distort, other than it's going to get a little bit narrower, okay? If we look at something like this, right, which is cut out, which is somewhat vertical but a little bit more flat grain, right? And we look at it, right? We're going to shrink a little bit this way, but we're also going to shrink, right, tangentially this way, which is going to cause this board to cup a little bit, right? If we come here, right, when we cut this piece out, we're going to shrink this way and this way, right? Likewise here, we're going to start to cup this way. So does this kind of make some intuitive sense, right? Depending on where this is cut, we're we're going to have different shrinkage, right? Likewise, you can see where some of these checks occur, right? Those can occur inside of these boards as well. Okay. So the other thing is lumber can be surfaced, right, to make it smoother and more usable. It can also be left rough, depending on what you want, right? So I have an example here. This is good. This is surface two sides, so it's S2S, right? We have a nice smooth surface that's been planed here. We have a nice smooth surface that's been planed here, but it's left rough on this surface and rough on this surface. Generally, the rough sawn is left like that for some kind of aesthetic look, right? Most structural lumber that we use in buildings is surfaced on four sides, so it's S4S, right, which is something like this, right? So it's smooth and planed on each of the four sides. We can get rough sawn on all sides, right? If we're going to hardwoods, it's typically just surfaced on two sides, the broader sides, because it's so valuable that you don't want to trim off any excess, right? You want to sell this as its untrimmed sheet, right? And then whoever the carpenter is that's going to work with it is going to make the maximum yield out of it, right? As opposed to cutting off and wasting anything. So that's more of an economical decision. So lumber defects can come from, right, growth characteristics, which is due to the growth of the tree, right? Or it can come from manufacturing characteristic caused during manufacture. So when we talked about all those shrinkage, this is probably the best example of what can happen to a piece of lumber. So at one point in time, this piece of lumber was straight, right? And it's been, cut in weird ways, or it's been cut so that it's just not in the best maximum use of a particular piece of lumber. And if we look very carefully at it, we can see, right, lots of the little splits that are happening, right, the checks due to the shrinkage, right, and it's also basically twisted, warped in every possible way, right? So, yeah, that sucks. That's a good example, right? But this is the example of the most extreme case. Not all lumber is going to do that, right? So growth characteristic defects, right, would be knot holes, decay, insect damage, fire damage, those kinds of things, right? Manufacturing defects would be changes resulting from differing rates of shrinkage. Think that board, right? Splits, checks, right? The reason it's manufacturing is because somebody decided how to make the maximum yield out of the board, right? The knot holes and stuff, I don't have any good examples of giant knot holes, right? But this would be an example, right? If we look at this end of this beam, right, which I don't have the full story on what happened here, right? But this is either a knot hole that's been pulled out, right, or it's some kind of a little defect that's in the particular piece of wood. And I don't know. I didn't cut this beam. I have no idea where it came from or what the defect was. I think it had something that was glued in at one point that was like a knot or something, but it's not here anymore. So. But we see the void nonetheless. So these are our different types of non-uniform shrinkage, right? Crook, right, is in the length of the board, right? A bow is in the flat side of the board, right? A cup is when the board twists up, right? And a twist is bad, right? So if you've ever been in Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, certainly if you were ever there when I was there, right, you'll see people that are climbing up in the lumber stacks and are going through, right, the whole pallet of lumber trying to find the best boards, right? And so if somebody was selecting a piece of lumber, like I was today, right, I happen to be buying redwood, which is expensive, so of course I'm going to go through and make sure that I get the maximum for my money, right? I'll go through the whole pallet, right, and I'll pick through every board, right, and I'm looking for boards that don't have any of these characteristics, right? I'm looking for the end grain so that I can see, did it include the pith? Did it include the center, right? That's bad because it's a weak point, right? I'm looking at this grain and I'm saying, what's going to happen as the board continues to season, right? Is it going to warp more? Is it going to twist? Are there any defects? Are there any splits? Are there any checks, right? And once I've gone through the pallet, chances are inside that pallet of, say, 40 boards, there's going to be a few that are really, really nice, right? Because it's kind of mixed. And there's going to be a few that are really, really bad, right? Well, I definitely don't want the really, really bad ones, and if I'm paying for it, I'd rather have the really, really good ones, right? So that's why people are up in those stacks shifting through as many as there are. grades occur, right, either for appearance or for structural and appearance, right? And that's going to depend on whatever the intended use is going to be, right? Lumber is sold by the species and the grade. The big beams in a house, right, or the primary structural members are often a higher grade because you don't want the primary beam in your house to do this, right? This would be bad, right? So you want the primary beam to be very dimensionally stable, to stay consistent, to not shrink too much, right? So you're going to pay more and get a higher grade of lumber. You don't want any big knot holes or anything that are disrupting the structural integrity of the lumber. The remaining members, right, are often an intermediate grade or a lower grade, right? They're going to have a little bit lower cost, right, and we're going to build the rest of the house out of this, okay? For blocking or for things that don't have too much structural value, although I will tell you from experience it's nicer for blocking, even if it's blocking, to use better stuff because you'll fight it later on when you put the sheetrock on and do the interior finishes. But you can basically use the lowest grade possible, maximize your money, right? Save a little money and use that. If you're smart about building, right, chances are you'll have some leftover pieces in the process. Use the leftover pieces of higher grade first before you buy, crappier grade stuff. Okay? And clearly we're having a bug convention here tonight. Structural grading can be done by machine or by a person, right? Skilled people can look at a piece of lumber and understand what its structural defects are. A machine can do the same sorts of thing. And basically they're looking for things like knot holes, right, that are running through the board that are disrupting the structural integrity of the board itself. Okay? Visual grading, which is done by a person, right, is to judge the overall quality of the particular lumber, right, and therefore how much can you sell it for, right? And this is for appearance purposes. Okay? And so there's grading rules industry-wide that kind of make everything the same, right? So people know what they're looking for, et cetera, right? So in a machine grading, an automatic device assesses the structural properties, right? And appearance grading is done visually, right? There are machines that can look at a piece and determine how many knots there are and therefore how visually appealing it would be, right? So we're moving the direction of more and more machine work, though most of it's still done by an actual person. So if we were building a house, right, the light wood framing, which we'll talk about in two lectures, because we have midterm next week and then two more. Is it I think it's 2 lectures, because I think we do heavy timber first. It's usually ordered number 2 and better, which means that the lowest grade lumber that'll show up at the site will be number 2, right? It will also include some number 1, right, and some select structural, depending on the lumber mill and how generous they are and the quality of the lumber that you get out of it, right? And you might have a few gripes about some of it not really being number 2, but such is life, right? So number 2 and better. And the nice thing about that is depending on what you're trying to do in the building, right, you can select the nicer pieces. It's like going to Home Depot and picking through the lumber to get the best lumber, right? When you're building a building, you're going to get it delivered by a pallet, not go to Home Depot and pick individual pieces. It takes too long, right? But you will go through the pallet and pick the best pieces for, say, your long rafters, right? You'll pick those pieces first, or your hip and jack rafters if you're framing a roof. You'll pick those pieces first because they're the most critical pieces. And then, right, for the blocking, right, you'll use the number 2 stuff, the not so good stuff, right? So you'll vary it when you're actually on the site, right? Right, and there's some things like if they're really bad, you can send them back to the lumber mill and say, no, I'm not paying for this because it's too bad, right? But you try to use up some of the lower end stuff, recognizing that you're accepting lower grade because it costs a little less if you're accepting the lower grade, right? And if you really want all high-end, nice lumber, then you'll pay more for it, and you'll know you'll get it. Right? So wood is usually stronger in compression than it is in tension, right? And the interesting thing about the tension in wood is wood doesn't fail by tension because the wood itself fails. Wood fails in tension because you can't attach to the wood in a way that will allow you to put it in enough tension to cause it to fail, right? So it's the attachment point that's the weak link, right? Because, for example, like steel, right, you can't weld one piece of wood to another piece of wood, right? You could glue one piece of wood to another piece of wood, but the glue isn't as strong as the wood itself, right? So it's always going to fail by the attachment point, right? It's stronger parallel to the grain than it is perpendicular to the grain, right? And its strength is going to vary by type and grading. Okay? So, the last thing, and then we're going to have our break. Lumber dimensions, right, are given in nominal dimensions. And I promise you right now that this will show up on a test, right? Because this is like critical thing that you know about wood, right? If I say I'm buying a 2x4, right, it doesn't mean that I'm buying a piece that's actually 2 inches by 4 inches, right? It means that it's something less than that. And this kind of formula varies a little bit. So we're going to walk through the formula, okay? Anywhere up to 6 inches, right, you can take that nominal dimension and subtract a half an inch, right? Anything larger than 6 inches, you're going to subtract 3/4 of an inch, right? So 6 inches is that cutoff, okay? So if I had a 2x10, right, its actual dimensions are going to be 1.5 inches, right, by 9.25, right? Which is, kind of weird, okay? The other thing about it is that if you're saying I want to buy a 2x4 and you're writing it down, it's not 2 inch marks by 4 inch marks. It's just 2x4, right? I lied. There's one more. There's a couple more slides, right? So does that make sense? So if I had a 2x4, sorry, right? Another couple minutes. If I had a 2x4, it would be. I know you're right. I'm just seeing if anybody else gets it. 1.5 by 3.5, right? If I had a 4x8, three and a half by 7.25, right? So you guys get the idea, okay? Okay, so then we have this other thing, right? Pieces of lumber that are 2 inches, right? That are less than 2 inches in nominal thickness, right? So thin pieces of lumber, like say this, right? This is like a 1x3 or something like that, right? It's going to be called a board, right? If it's from 2 inches to 4 inches in thickness, something like this or something like this, it's going to be called dimension lumber, right? Which is what we tend to build with, right? And if it's anything larger than 4 inches, 5 inches or more, right? It's referred to as timbers, right? We'll talk about heavy timber construction in a little bit. Okay? And clear out. You know what? Let's just stop here because I did promise a break. I've got like 2 slides until the break. Well, whatever. Do you guys want to keep going for 2 slides? Can you handle it? Okay. Sorry. So lumber is commonly supplied in 2-foot increments, right? 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet, 14 feet, 16 feet. If we're doing rafters, you can get up to 24 feet, right? Which is going to be a higher grade lumber, right? And lumber is sold by what's called the board foot, which is a measurement based on a nominal dimension. Okay, so the easiest way to do this is to actually draw it. Okay. Let's say I have a 2x6, right? So this is again nominal, not actual, right? It's a 2x6, right? And I have 1 foot of it. Okay. This would be 1 board foot, right? So I take the cross-sectional, right, dimensions, right? So 2x6 is 12, so it's 12 square inches by a foot, right? If I had this would be a 1x12, right, by 1 foot. And so this is again 1 foot, right? That would also be 1 board foot. Make sense? Right? So if I had, let's see here, a 4x6 by 1 foot, 2 board feet. What if it was 2 feet long? Right? 4 board feet. That make sense? Yeah? Right? So this is a board foot. This is 2 board feet. right, of lumber. Make sense? Yeah? Okay. Now we're going to break.